Hey friends, welcome back to the next episode. Last episode we discussed Yuri on Ice and changing landscapes in gay representation. Now we're talking about gay representation, explicitly gay representation. We get to talk about Stars Align. Stars Align is an anime written by Kazuki Akane and produced by the studio 8-Bit, and it aired from October 10th to December 26, 2019. It follows a failing boys' soft tennis team as they strive to keep their club afloat while their positions in life consistently trod them down. It has a softer, more casual energy, perhaps even comparable to Amanchu, but with a consistent focus on the soft tennis plot, even as it pales in comparison to the intense side stories. Stars Align is unique in how far it really goes to acknowledge the queer characters. The first episode, the main character, Maki Katsuragi, acknowledges that the team manager, Yu Asuke, has a crush on the team's captain. He accepts it in a casual manner and casts little judgment. Yu Asuke is shown being bullied for their effeminacy as they are assigned male at birth. The weirdness of Yuri on Ice is. It is also important to acknowledge the real-life environment that queer people have to endure, especially in smaller towns, especially in high school. When interviewed, members of the LGBTQ+ community living in smaller towns usually felt less safe coming out than those living in a bigger city. Acknowledging the real-life struggle of queer folks can get tiring after a while. There are critiques in modern media for doubling down on the queerness as trauma deal for every gay character. However, watching these topics being discussed as they are on an anime not entirely focused on gay characters feels honest to the tone of the show and exploring the various ways those overlooked by the system are affected by this neglect. They are not more traumatized by their experiences than the other boys are by their parental situations. The way the others react to them, protecting them from the usual bullying, provides the fantasy. The children all find solace in each other, the queer kid included with no question, even if they aren't out. Also, the conversation makes more sense in a high school setting than it would between adults, like in Yuri on Ice. The characters aren't actualized in any parts of their identity, especially not parts that are seen as taboo in modern culture. Of course, there's an even more explicit example of the discussion later on in the series. To spy on the enemy team, Maki Katsuragi and Yu Asuke both dress up as girls. They aren't arrested for trespassing on the grounds, something that Yu suggests. While they dress up, Yu asks if Maki minds that they know how to do makeup, which Maki doesn't. Instead, he tells the story of a good friend of his mother's who took care of him often, explaining how he was born, quote-unquote, into the wrong gender, and describes him as F to M. That stands for female to male. That's a trans guy. Yuta then confirms that they feel uncomfortable with the idea of being a boy to the point they might die, but they aren't comfortable with being a girl either. Then it shows a shot of them reading a book on LGBTQ+ and saying that they think they would be defined as non-binary, but they feel uncomfortable with labels. The acknowledgement of happy queer adults, especially transgender adults, is extremely important, especially for a high school anime supposedly marketed toward high schoolers. Members of the trans community, especially trans teenagers, have a higher risk for suicide. There's also much stigma around the trans community, even as gay acceptance is on the rise. There is a Gender Identity Disorder and Special Cases Act that has been in effect in Japan since about 2003 that lets transgender people change their legal gender, given, of course, that they are diagnosed with gender identity disorder, sterilized, 20 or over, unmarried, and do not have young children. This, of course, would not be viable to someone like you who is still exploring their gender identity and might not want such drastic changes to themselves, or might not want any changes at all. In a survey done by Ipsos, they found only 48% of participants in Japan believe transgenderism was a natural occurrence, and only 41% agreeing they should do something more to protect and support transgender people. Trans rights is something recently being brought back into mainstream culture, so non-binary characters are even further between. Non-binary people in Japan have found it unsafe to come out, and of course there's no hope with the draconian GID law. There are also issues with anime and Japanese culture in general, as we discussed with Reo, conflating non-binary gender expression and homosexuality. I don't know if I have the authority to name this as a trope, but it's definitely the Okama stereotype in Japanese anime that is especially guilty of misrepresentation of trans or non-binary identities. Okama is just a general term to refer to homosexual men, and is sometimes used to refer to drag queens, with which Japan has had a colored history with, to say the least. It's Japanese slang, but it can border on slur if misused. And A lot of Japanese anime has used this sort of stereotype of like a big burly man that wears lipstick or women's underwear, like a lumbering sort of beast that is something to be feared or confused / disgusted by. It's in a lot of anime and a lot of shonen, to be exact. There's the trap stereotype, which is interesting, about a young, effeminate looking boy who most of the characters assume is a girl until he somehow reveals the fact he has a penis, and then the whole thing is just, it goes downhill from there. It's usually played for comedy, like, oh god, you accidentally had a crush on what appears to be a dude. This fear of straight men thinking that they're going to engage in quote-unquote gay sex with quote-unquote not a real woman is something that pervades Western culture as well. It's an ongoing debate about whether or not disclosing one's trans identity should be necessary while engaging in intercourse with a straight guy, for trans women, of course. The trap stereotype is especially prevalent in anime meme communities, and there are funny, nuanced takes on it, and there are less funny, nuanced takes. It's currently being revamped with the whole femboy movement that's going on in the West, I'm aware of, but I don't have enough research about femboys in Japan to make an informed statement about that. As discussed in the Kuroko no Basuke episode, there is a deep discomfort with men who are effeminate in a lot of Japanese media. Because as we discussed in the Prince of Tennis episode, effeminacy is a part of the Japanese beauty ideal for men as well. Usually the mockery is that there is an aesthetic failure, as we discussed earlier with the big burly man and then effeminate features or like hobbies. It's seen as demeaning. It's usually put up as a point of comedy, and I understand it's a joke and that people have a right to jokes they find funny. There is something a little bit disturbing about seeing a guy whose pain is usually played very straight in the comedic bit, like legitimate hurt about not being accepted in his just gender expression. It gets a little bit uncomfortable. And then usually the situation can turn violent because, big burly man, and if it's shown in anime, then the protagonist eventually has to fight big burly man in a dress whose main feature is that he's in a dress, and that's scary because it doesn't look good and it's ugly or something like that. While there is an acceptance to a certain degree of what the West would view as more effeminate features on a man in Japanese culture, it still needs to be meeting a certain level of aesthetics before it is accepted in its totality. This whole tangent is to say that the way that anime treats gender nonconforming people, especially AMAB people, is just truly awful. So, this earnest engagement with their identity is a very necessary conversation to have, and is handled quite gracefully. It also shows some of the euphoria that comes with queerness. The character finds acceptance with Maki and finds happiness in being able to express himself in feminine clothing in the episode. Unlike the other boys, their trauma isn't something they necessarily have to run from. One's relationship with queerness can be complicated like that. It is also worth mentioning that the main character, Maki, has some envy vibes as well. He answers the other boys' claim that his visor that he wears is something only girls wear inconclusively, instead of doubling down on his masculinity. And he responds to Yu's confession with an admittance, "I'm the same as you." It can be said that he meant this about also being an overlooked part of society because he's in a lower income household and has a single mother and a dad who stalks and abuses him. Stars Align is a very soft yet very intense show. There is an issue about the show. It has very positive ratings and There are issues with the show, like it has very positive ratings until the cliffhanger on the last episode and the announcement that the show hadn't been greenlit for a full season. Similarly to Yuri, the director made the opposite choice of Yuri's director, refusing to change the pacing of the show and instead making it as if he would have the second season, with no guarantee of a second season. I feel is an example of constructive rep that isn't exploitative in the least bit and is instead a genuine interaction with queerness as it affects people in reality, and it does work to normalize the idea of being non-binary, being trans, and many other things outside of queerness, but we're focused on the queerness right now. Now, that was in 2019. We're going to regress a bit with the next episode, where we'll be talking about Skate the Infinity and queer coding.